Thank you for joining the webinar on minimizing wastage and optimizing ROI in digital advertising. In today's webinar, we have guest speaker Belinda Barker, Managing Director of BSBMedia, and Michael Greene, Director of Research at AudienceScience, and they will discuss the industry problems that the survey results reveal from the CMO white paper. They'll provide insights on how you can eliminate such problems in your own digital advertising solution. Thank you, Michael and Belinda, for joining us today, and they will begin the webinar.
Thanks, Allison, and thanks again to Belinda for joining us for today's webinar and for conducting such fascinating research. Welcome, everybody, to the webinar. I hope that you'll find today's topic interesting. We have a lot of fascinating insights to share around the topic of how marketers can minimize waste and optimize their own ROI. But before we get to the survey, Belinda, could you talk a little bit about the methodology and how we got so much great data?
Thank you, Michael. I'm here to give a little bit of wider information about the survey itself. Now, it was called the International Media Image Survey, and it was the first survey of the type conducted in the second quarter of this year. The survey itself was actually supported by WARC and the IAA, which is the International Advertising Association. And we measured two audiences. We looked at advertisers and CMOs, and we talked to them about their views about the wider media industry and media agencies. We also talked directly to the media agencies as a second universe about buying behaviors. We looked at the behavior of individual media brands and buying practices and expenditure or planned expenditure over the next 18 months. So it was an online survey, and we looked specifically at international companies. So everybody who was interviewed had an international or global remit, and they were asked about international brands. And we interviewed over 300 people for this project. If you'd like to move to the next slide, Michael.
Thanks, Belinda. So before we dive into the details of survey results, let's get an overview of some of the key findings, in particular how they pertain to how CMOs are viewing digital today. First, one of the most interesting findings we had, and probably not surprising to many of you on the phone, is that many advertisers today remain uncertain of the ROI of digital. In fact, 40% of the advertisers surveyed reported to us that they had yet to find a good way to determine the ROI of their digital efforts. Now, interestingly enough, one of the reasons for this is that many advertisers felt that they lacked the detailed insight necessary on how their budget was being allocated. In fact, nearly 2/3 of the advertisers surveyed reported that they lacked detail on how and where their money is spent, making it more difficult for them to really understand how that is driving ROI and to optimize accordingly. On top of that, we also found that many advertisers had some misconceptions about how much of their budget was going to working media versus other sorts of costs and intermediary fees. In fact, many advertisers thought that their agency was the only intermediary, typically taking around 10% of their media budget, but don't necessarily take into account other middlemen from ad networks, data providers, etc., that are playing a major role in digital advertising today and costing advertisers a substantial amount of their budget. But ultimately, what we found, and we'll be discussing in much greater depth later today, is that advertisers concluded that the real key to minimizing waste is transparency. And in fact, 40% believe that if they had technology that would enable them more transparency into their spend, allow them to see where their money was going and the cost involved, it would help them greatly in the efforts of minimizing waste. So a bit of a preview about what we'll be talking about more in depth today. But before we get into greater detail, Belinda, would you like to take us through some of the higher level findings from the overall survey, starting with how CMOs are viewing agency performance today?
Media agencies basically have to be good at everything. As you can see, there's only a few percentage points difference between strategic planning, ability, creativity, buying strength, consumer insight, and ability to deliver ROI. So it's not a matter of being good at one thing. You have to be good at everything. But we didn't just look at what they were looking for. We also looked at which media agencies were perceived to be good at the different activities. If you could just click on for me, Michael. Here you can see that Mindshare is perceived to be the best at delivering strategic planning. Now, you see it twice here on the screen. First of all, it's among all advertisers, and secondly, we're looking at non-clients. So we exclude the advertisers who have Mindshare as an agency. So what you're seeing is that even in the broader market, they're perceived as offering strong strategic planning abilities. Similarly, with Zenith Optimedia and the ability to offer ROI, and Mediacom and buying strength. For the other criteria, it's more of a mixed picture where the advertisers don't necessarily perceive their own agency the way that the wider world does. We also looked at what was important to advertisers when they are looking at media brands. Now, again, they do have to be good at everything that they do, but creativity and flexibility was really prioritized as being important for media partners. If you could move on, Michael, thank you. So what became very clear is how much the whole landscape has changed for media brands in the last few years. Here we've got a list of the top 8 brands that the advertisers and agencies had done business with in the last 12 months. And as you can see, only 3 out of the top 8 brands were what you would call traditional media brands. And this is a big change from how it would have been viewed 2 or even 3 years ago. We can also look at which brands people like doing business with versus those they didn't like doing business with. So some brands, as it said here, are what we call Marmite brands, where there's a lot of people who really love them and a lot of people who really hate them. The brands doing really well are obviously those that just have lots of people who really love them. But it's interesting that the really big brands, so going back to, if you remember our list previously of those that most had done business with, so Google, Facebook, Financial Times tend to be the most pulled out. You have people at the top and at the bottom end. Odyssey, not necessarily one of the biggest brands mentioned, but they're clearly loved by the clients who do business with them. We also measured each of the media brands against all the different factors, but here, Michael, if you could just move on. If you're just looking at ROI as an individual measure, you can see again here, we're looking at the perception of all respondents, and then secondly in the blue we're looking at people who'd actually already done business with their clients. So overall, Google, more people perceived Google as being the best at delivering ROI, and even within their own client group that continues to go up. The Financial Times, overall less considered in the outside group that they were delivering ROI, but their own client base had a really, really strong perception for the ability to deliver. And again, even more so if you look at videology, only a small base within the overall universe, but their own clients, although there's only a few of them, had a strong perception of offering ROI. So those are the kind of some of the ways you can look at the broader data of the survey, but now we're going to start drilling down more into how people are spending money and how budgets are looking like changing over time. And I don't think it'll be any surprise to anybody who's here on this call is that digital is growing rapidly and is already fairly significant. Here we go. So the breakdown overall, this is their expenditure in 2013. So within the advertisers, 30% or 30.3% were they were spending their 30%. Sorry, of the advertisers, they were spending 30% of their total budget on one of the digital platforms. Advertisers and agencies, however, are leading the way perhaps or pushing the agenda forward with almost anticipation of spending nearly 50% of their total budgets on one of the digital platforms. Michael?
Yeah, but I think it's helpful as we look at all this and how people perceive this for this year is that TV is really still the dominant player in this space. But so when you look at both the focus of senior marketing executives inside the brands themselves as well as the agencies, so much of time and energy is going to where much of the big money has been going traditionally, which is TV. And while that pool certainly is shrinking, and as was noted by Belinda and clear in the survey, digital is growing quite substantially, and the expectation is for it to grow exponentially, especially once we start looking at the larger advertisers. We defined it for the sake of the survey as marketers who spend over £12 million a year in paid media. Those budgets tend to be very heavily concentrated in TV, where we look at paid media channels in digital, whether it be digital display, video, search, social media, or even emerging channels like mobile, accounting for a relatively smaller percent of the budget. But Belinda, I think you're absolutely right. You know, when we look at where the attention is right now, certainly heavy attention is being paid to digital, while so much of the budget is still going into traditional channels, namely television.
And as we move ahead over the next 18 months, that's only set to grow. Now, do bear in mind that we are talking about international advertisers here, so they're clients who are operating in at least one country. The majority of them, in fact, had responsibility for not just multiple countries, but multiple regions of the world. So it is not necessarily reflective of an average UK advertiser. But if we're looking here, again, at anticipated growth over the next 18 months, I think the chart pretty much speaks for itself. You can see immediately from the purple lines where the growth is going to be coming from, and mobile and social, okay, from smaller bases, are growing faster and faster. Back to you, Michael.
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting, right? So it's clear advertisers are absolutely following the consumer into the digital channels, especially when we look at some of the new up-and-coming channels. Mobile, obviously, here ranking quite highly when it comes to look at growth, and very few advertisers seeing a decline in mobile. No surprise with the prevalence of smartphones and the opportunities to reach customers there. I guess my big concern that came out of the survey and the results is, while advertisers are very keen to invest more and more in the digital area, especially channels like display, video, and mobile, advertisers still today are still, by a large margin, unsure of the efficacy of digital and are still trying to figure out how they would even discover if digital is being effective or not. So let's dive in a little bit deeper onto this data. As I mentioned earlier when going over the key findings, I think one of the most important things that we found is that 40% of the advertisers that we surveyed still haven't even found a good way to measure digital. So while 35% feel like they're getting good ROI, they have a sound methodology for assessing digital's impact. An even larger percentage simply say they're not even sure how to best measure it, not even sure that it doesn't provide a good ROI or does. I think this problem is only exacerbated for companies that have offline sales channels. So when we look at companies with, say, in the e-commerce space, the travel space, even financial services where there's a strong online transactional element, some of these challenges of tracking ROI, while they certainly do exist, are somewhat diminished simply by the fact that the data is possible to get at. But for many of these advertisers, especially those in categories like FMCG, where the vast majority of the sales are happening offline, being able to attribute credit back to digital has absolutely been a challenge. And while digital creates even more data for measurement than potentially traditional media, I think many marketers are still struggling to say which data points are really important, which indicate success, and which aren't that important or aren't that indicative of ultimate success. But I think the major issue that's hanging over all of this is this notion of transparency. And we'll talk about in a second about what we see as having true transparency and where I think so many marketers have gone in terms of thinking about transparency. But I think, at the most basic level, transparency can be defined as knowing what you're buying and knowing how much it costs. It's very difficult for any of us to understand if something was worth it or not if we didn't know what we bought or what we paid for it. So one of the questions that we wanted to ask these digital media buyers is, to what extent do they receive a detailed explanation of the costs associated with their digital media activity? And while a third of them reported that they receive fully transparent reports of all media costs, all third-party fees involved, whether they be for technology, data, other services, as well as something we call margin taking on top of that media, a substantially larger percentage of those advertisers, in fact, over 70% in this case, felt that they lacked that sort of detail. So 46% of these said that they received only a high-level summary of what was happening with their advertising dollar amount. And 17% said that they got no detail whatsoever in terms of the cost associated with their media campaigns. And as you can imagine, for these advertisers, very difficult to understand what's working, what's not, what's driving ROI, if there's not a good explanation as to what it ultimately cost. And I think that goes to the point that transparency does matter. Imagine many of you on the phone have fairly detailed AOR agreements with your media agency of record, and certain rules about transparency into costs and other things are in there. And it's important not just because it's in the contract, but it's important because of what it can drive for you as a business. As I mentioned, it's about finding what works and what doesn't. This leads to more efficiency and less waste. But it's also about how you get deeper insight, how you get better governance, ultimately hold people accountable for what they're doing. And I think, in the long run, how you build smarter media strategies going forward, learning from past efforts, understanding what works, what doesn't, and being able to better guide these strategies forward, both at a local and a global basis. And I think we also find that transparency in digital comes down more to cost. While in the survey, there was a strong focus from these advertisers into this lack of detailed transparency on the cost side, when we look at digital and the complexity of the ecosystem, so it's only getting more complex as we add additional channels like mobile and social into the digital mix, being able to answer what seem to be incredibly easy questions, and questions that typically are fairly easy to answer when we look at a traditional media environment, we find aren't necessarily very easy to answer for many digital media buyers. And these are pretty simple things. Where are ads running? Why are they running there? Who's seeing my ads? Are they my target audience? How many times are they seeing them? At what frequency? Who's involved in this process? Is it me working directly with a publisher? Are there multiple intermediaries all taking fees in this process? And then ultimately, what are you paying for all of this? Going to this notion of cost transparency. And I think, for those of you on the phone who oversee a digital team or come from a digital team, if your team can't answer these questions very easily today, it's a pretty good sign that there is a transparency issue, and really understanding ROI and driving better ROI is going to be a difficult process for you going forward. And I think one of the factors that's associated with this lack of transparency and this lack of knowledge of what's actually going on with their digital ad spend is that many marketers we found in the survey are dramatically underestimating the non-working media cost associated with their campaigns. And by working media, I'm referring to simply costs that go directly towards showing an impression to a targeted customer. As I mentioned before in the intro, for many media buyers, there's this strong assumption that all non-working media costs are essentially their agency fee. And agencies play an incredibly important role in this process, and they can, can quibble about their fees, and we negotiate those, but we'd hopefully say a reasonable fee for the work they do. I think the challenge for many digital media owners is that once they start looking actually at the value chain, where their ad dollar, pound, or euro is in fact going, when digging into detail, they find that there are many, many other intermediaries sitting between them and the publishers who connect them to their ultimate consumer. In fact, a study by Boston Consulting Group that came out earlier this year found that your typical digital advertising campaign has about 20 different intermediaries sitting between you, the advertiser, and ultimately the end consumer. And yes, the agency and publisher are part of that, but we're talking about multiple layers that I'll detail in a moment. So the reality for so many marketers is that, well, the strong belief is that these costs are relatively low. The fact of it being so complex to execute a digital advertising campaign means that oftentimes these intermediary costs look much more in the 10 to 25% range or the 25 to 50% range. But the lack of detail into how many intermediaries are there and what costs are associated with them certainly makes it more difficult for advertisers to evaluate their value and effectiveness. So this is a bit of a more detailed explanation of what's happening here. I mentioned the complexity in the supply chain and how oftentimes over 20 different intermediaries can be involved. So this is certainly a more simplified type of diagram. But you can certainly imagine if you're an advertiser and you're working with ad networks whose business model is based upon buying media at a low cost and reselling it to the agency and to ultimately the advertiser at a higher price than they acquired it for the publisher, their fundamental business model is making what we call a non-transparent margin of anywhere from 20 to 40%. You could imagine something similar is also happening if you're doing things through an entity called an agency trading desk, who typically sometimes take a service fee. 15% is the general range on top of what they do, but could also buy in an ad network type way and engage in that arbitrage activity. But I think the essential point is here, with every layer introduced, there's a cost to it. And not having a detailed understanding of that cost makes it very hard to evaluate, well, is the cost of this provider worth it? Are they adding truly incremental value? Or are they simply a non-value added reseller of something that an advertising agency could get more easily and more cost effectively, say going directly to a publisher in a much more direct way. So one of the things that we wanted to find is say, okay, it seems like advertisers have a lot of challenges in the digital space, right? ROI is uncertain. It's very clear that many feel that there's a lack of transparency into what's going on in the ecosystem. Well, what could they do about it? And for me, as somebody who works at a technology company, I was very heartened to hear that many of them are looking towards technology really as the answer. So 40% of the advertisers surveyed said that they desire to use a tool that provides a transparent view into their digital media spend, understanding of where that ad spend is going, who's taking what cut to help them better manage ROI. Interestingly enough, what we heard from some of them, 27% in fact, was looking to move more of this functionality internally in-house. Now, to be clear, I think for a lot of these advertisers, that doesn't mean ridding themselves of agency relationships completely, but instead looking to do things like say, what types of technologies do we need to own in-house rather than necessarily have everything outsourced to a third party, such as the agency. So some marketers are certainly looking to say, what can we bring in-house? How can we use technology to get more transparency? And ultimately, I think most interestingly, if you look at the third from the top, it's about getting more granular in terms of how they look at their digital media spend, how they look at individual placements, right? If you recall, many of those advertisers cited they're getting very high-level information when it comes to what's working and what's not. What we saw from a quarter of these advertisers is that they're really thinking about how they get more control of their advertising placements on a more granular level. And looking towards the future, the biggest trend that we see is really more advertisers taking control of these individual placements, taking it back from an ecosystem where publishers really control which ad gets served, where, when, and to whom, and let the advertiser really dictate their requirements on an impression-by-impression level. And I think that leads us to our key takeaways that we have for today. So the ultimate question for me that came out of the survey is, what can marketers do to ensure transparency and drive ROI? And as we just reviewed, for so many marketers, it seems like technology really is the answer. But I would say, unless applied correctly, and unless you look to have the level of granularity in that technology that you need, the level of granular insight that you need to really understand what's happening with your digital advertising spend, it's going to be very difficult to not only understand what's driving ROI or not, but most importantly, be able to take action on that information, get better, and ultimately minimize wastage and improve your ROI. And as I did mention, for many marketers, this may mean thinking a little more in depth about what needs to be managed internally, technology being something that absolutely in many cases can be, just like it has been for many other parts of your organization, and thinking very concretely about which tasks get outsourced, where your partners, whether they be agencies or media owners, can really begin to add a lot of value, and how technology can be used internally to help you drive transparency, eliminate waste, and ultimately increase ROI through that level of transparency. And with that, I think that's the end of our review of the survey results. At this point, we're going to open up the line, open up the comment box for questions. If you do have a question, please type it in to the chat box below. We'll be more than happy to answer those questions.
Great. Thank you, Michael and Belinda. So I see there are a couple questions coming in. So one of the ones that I see is, let's see, what is the best way that you think to measure ROI in digital advertising currently? So I'll let Belinda or Michael take that one.
Thanks, Allison. The question, I think, is really determined based upon what your goal is as an advertiser. I would say no matter who you are as a business, ultimately what you're looking to do is connect the dollar you spend to one thing. And for most organizations, that's going to be sales. Now, I think the challenge for many different advertisers, and I mentioned this earlier, is that if you're an organization that's primarily reliant on an offline sales channel, drawing that direct connection between what's happening in the digital space and what's happening offline is a challenging process. But there are a few things that every advertiser can do to make that easier, more accurate, and I think ultimately create a measurement model that helps them get better at their advertising going forward. So I think the first thing that every advertiser should do if they have this particular challenge is eliminate as much white noise as possible. So what I mean by that is if you think about the tools that you have for digital advertising today, whether it's your ad server or if you're using a more advanced tool for things like programmatic buying, your access to data is almost limitless. You can measure almost any metric under the sun. Now, the challenge is that most of those metrics are going to be absolutely meaningless. And many of the most common metrics that advertisers use, such as click-through rate, have been shown again and again through reputable research by firms like Nielsen to be absolutely disconnected in any way imaginable with what your organization ultimately cares about, which is selling product in stores. So with that in mind, I think what marketers really need to do is start assessing and saying, what are the one or two true KPIs that we can look at and begin to build these correlations with what we see long-term happening in the offline world. So what we've seen some large, fairly advanced marketers that we have as clients is really beginning to build models using their own in-house analytics teams, looking at one or two KPIs in digital. So think about these things as a great example would be site engagement. So if you're an FMCG brand, what you're really looking at is say, okay, the job of my media online is, ultimately I want people to go to the store and buy my product, but what's going to be a good proxy for that I can measure in real time online and use to optimize against? So it might be saying, what are those really particular site actions that I want them to take? And can I track back and say, is my media actually influencing those site actions? And from there, then it's just building that correlation over time to understand, hey, if I'm seeing more of this particular KPI, more of these particular site actions, is that ultimately correlated in a statistically significant way with the success that I'm seeing in the offline world? I think for advertisers that have a purely online purchase path, there are a lot of off-the-shelf tools that can make this measurement process much more simple and streamlined. I think for many of these advertisers today, they're still reliant on fairly crude measurement tools that don't take into account the full experience of that user interacting with your many different touch points, whether it be mobile, online video, your site, email. But there's a class of tools that go by the term advanced attribution tools that are really great at bringing all this data together and building models to help you understand which combinations of touch points are driving success for your business. So if you're somebody with an online sales channel, that's something that I would certainly recommend you diving more deeply into if you haven't already today.
Great, thank you. We do have another question as well. What do you believe is the most effective manner to measure video advertising ROI? CTR is not it. So that's something that's definitely been a big topic. So Michael or Belinda, do you want to take that?
Yeah, thanks, Allison. That's a good question. As I mentioned earlier, I have always been down on CTR as a metric, and you don't have to take it from me. I think there's the litany of research from firms like Nielsen and ComScore have really shown that it's a relatively poor indicator, and I think especially so when we think about more brand-oriented channels like online video. If you think about the user experience, they're watching that video because they really want to get to this great piece of content. So I think it comes down to a couple things when we're looking at online video. I think first you want to get an understanding of, hey, is somebody actually even seeing this ad, right? The fundamental thing you want out of every advertisement. And this can be, in the online video environment, actually trickier to measure than you might imagine, and even trickier to enforce. But at the bare minimum, what you should be expecting is, if I'm intending to buy a TV-like experience, that what you're getting is pre-roll in a user-initiated video player. That means the user intended to go there, it just didn't pop up on the screen and start playing, and that it was viewable on the screen at that point in time. The next thing you want to look at is say, did somebody actually complete this video, right? And this is a level of addressability that we don't have in television today, right? We all have the experience of getting up when the commercials come on the television, going and making a snack, going to the restroom, so on and so forth. But in video, there is that capability of understanding, hey, is somebody actually completing this particular ad unit with a good degree of certainty? So looking at things like completion rate can be very useful. But I think from there, it's really tracking back to, okay, what are those overall digital KPIs that I was just speaking about a minute ago, and can we build those correlations between what we're seeing on the online video side and ultimately what we're seeing in those ultimate digital KPIs. But the bare minimum, what you should be looking at is making sure, if I want to buy a TV experience, I'm buying pre-roll, it's user-initiated, it is a viewable ad unit, and the ad unit plays all the way through. It's actually completed.
Great, thank you. We have another question as well. So for distributors that promote online on behalf of the brand, it becomes difficult to measure ROI, linking sales to online advertising spend. In this instance, what is the best solution, or indeed any solutions for this?
Yeah, so if I'm understanding this question correctly, this would be the case where you're a third party and you don't have that direct access to that ultimate data. So I think one of the interesting things that we're seeing advertisers begin to do in these type of scenarios, and sometimes it's inhibited by broader restrictions, regulatory restrictions in some cases, but it's certainly becoming more possible, is finding ways for companies and their distributors to do things like data sharing. What that would look like is, imagine a case where somebody and their ultimate retailer distribution partner, whoever has that most knowledge about the customer, is sharing some data about the customer for targeting purposes online. And in return, you could imagine whoever's owning that end customer relationship, actually getting the product to the customer, is sharing more sales data ultimately back. And I think it seems very abstract, but you could imagine a scenario where, using a technology such as the one that we built here at AudienceScience, we're bringing that data into the same place, allows the advertiser and that distributor to really begin to see that path to purchase all the way through. But without having that data in one place, it's going to be very difficult to get that ultimate direct sales measurement. Otherwise, I think you are very reliant on some of those proxy KPIs. So that could be anything from this kind of site engagement metrics that we spoke of earlier, or even more common traditional tactics like brand surveys in some cases, granted if you can get the type of statistically significant sample size that you need to say, hey, this is a good indicator. The challenge with those sometimes is it's very hard to optimize what you're doing based upon those, given that it can be rather difficult to get enough sample to really have confidence that what you're doing is driving the right impact or not.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more questions coming in as well. So, do the learnings from the white paper also relate directly to other media channels, including video, mobile, and TV?
Yeah, I'd say yes to all of the above. When I think of digital, I'm certainly, I think like many advertisers, online video as well as mobile are subject to many of the same challenges as what we think of as with traditional display advertising. In many ways, mobile is even more complex in terms of thinking about that supply chain and less addressable because many of the technologies that are used to measure things online and provide a certain amount of transparency simply aren't as scalable or as applicable in a mobile environment. Think cookies, for instance, for things like tracking. But many of the same rules, because of that, certainly do apply. So the same types of best practices of what you should be expecting, you should be asking the same things about a mobile or video environment. But the solution from a technology perspective or how your technology partner has to approach solving for those problems is going to be slightly different from a technical area, but you as the marketer should have the same expectation because the same challenges exist. I think the interesting thing with TV right now is that unlike digital, it's certainly less fragmented. The supply chains are more condensed, right? So it's easier to really figure out where the money is going and how it's flowing, and there's less leverage in the ecosystem for advertisers to really change that. But what I think we're going to see over the next 2 to 3 years are many of the technologies that are common in digital today for creating that level of targeting, measurement, addressability are going to be very active in moving into the TV environment as well. I know that's something that we talk about almost daily here and are already having to plan for down the road because that time's going to be here sooner than any of us actually think. So while certainly I think the problems are much, much greater when we think about what's happening in the digital channels and the challenges with even determining ROI, many of the best practices that we learn in solving for those will also be applicable in the TV environment and be able to drive greater ROI and success there as well.
Great, thank you. And we have another one coming in. So client trading desks, a reality or a dream?
It's absolutely a reality today. I could say, hate to toot our own horn, but as a business, we're powering multiple of them. Right now is the technology solution. It's no secret in the industry that our largest client, Procter & Gamble, operates a client-side trading desk based upon built off kind of the AudienceScience platform. So it's certainly real, and I think it's my bet has been, and it's the case since I've been here for a year, and it was something that I believed. I was an analyst at Forrester for over 5 years covering the ad technology space there, something I certainly believed would become more and more prominent over the course of time when I was there. I think it's just the history of technology, right? Technology has always been the case of disintermediating intermediaries, and that's certainly happening with advertising as technology solutions are giving individual advertisers, both large and small, direct access to ad impressions, data, and other types of solutions that previously have only been achievable by pooling together massive buying cloud and all those resources. So it's a real democratizing moment in the media space right now. And I think going back to that notion of transparency, what I'm seeing in the market right now is that as more and more marketers say, hey, transparency is really the fulcrum to us understanding how we can do better going forward, that's where this interest in client-side trading desk, bringing technology in-house, really comes to the forefront because they are looking for this transparent alternative, and they're looking for the ability to gain greater insight into what's working and what's not so they can make better strategic plans going forward and do so in a very cost-effective way as well.
Great, thank you. We've had some really good questions. So if there's anything else, Michael and Belinda's information is at the end of the slide, and we will make this presentation available for everyone. It'll be on the AudienceScience.com website, as well as we'll be emailing a copy of this presentation out to everyone that attended the webinar. So thank you very much, everyone that joined. And Michael and Belinda, anything to cap it off with?
No, I just want to thank everybody for joining us. Obviously, everything is changing incredibly quickly, so it'll be interesting to see what next year's survey has to say, but I suspect it will be a completely different picture than the one we're looking at today. Anyway, thank you very much. And Michael?
Yeah, I'd like to say thanks, Belinda, for this wonderful survey. I think it's great insight. And thank you, everybody, so much for spending your morning or your afternoon joining us today. I hope you found it useful and you have some insight to bring back to your organization.
Thank you. Bye-bye.